Have you ever wanted to get into YouTube? Spent the last year collecting footage, only for it to end up looking like this. Terrible, I know. Frame rate close to being a desktop background dire show? Or maybe comparable to arc aberration playing on a HP 650 G5 or some other laptop. But anyways, that's how it is. So, welcome to my channel, I guess. Let's make something out of it. 1 year ago I had the idea to start making a game, and how do you start other than with a start button? I knew I wanted the game to take place in the desert, but the only problem being I did not know how to make a desert background. So that's where the tutorials began. I quickly had to realize that YouTube doesn't have what I came looking for, so instead I decided to start somewhere else, namely the player, or at least the player controlled object. Since I already knew what it was going to look like, I immediately started 3D modeling in Blender, but there's one problem: I absolutely suck at using Blender, so I eventually found myself back where I started. Anyways, I knew the game was supposed to be a top-down shooter where the player controls a stationary object, which he uses to defend himself against an onslaught of enemies. Finally finished the desert background. So I eventually started with 3D modeling my enemies. The game itself was supposed to be a military style, which means I wanted the players to fight against modern Humvees and tanks. I decided to create the 3D assets in Blender, even though it was later going to be rendered onto 2D. In addition, I started making a turret so that the enemies could actually shoot the player, so I started shading it and imported it into Godot. And after implementing the first enemy, I decided to make more. Tada! And since the enemies would drain your life over time, I decided to give the player an ability to heal itself by destroying its enemies, which eventually drop a medkit. I actually had the intention of making a small game over the period of maybe 2 months, but instead this one took a whole year. I then went on to modeling my menu items and user interface in Blender. And yes, before you ask, I actually do make my menus and interface items in Blender. Anyways, boss fight time. I decided, and it was a great mistake, to implement a boss, because it took an eternity. You can't even imagine how many bugs this thing had. When it was finally done, I was so glad that I could return to the usual business. Yoink! Tada! Shockwave. By the way, look at this amazing shader I did in Blender. So at one point I'm already at about 500% of the time I actually wanted to put into this project, but it started to look really good. But there was one issue.
No music!
And this is how I got into digital music creation. Not recommended. I knew this wasn't going to be easy. But soon I came up with something that at least was similar to a melody. Okay, I lied, this is terrible. This isn't close to being a melody. In addition, I wanted something more with a desert touch. Still terrible. And in addition to that, it gets only more boring from here on. Let's jump to something more interesting, namely this little feature that lets the user change in-game variables, which obviously led to Humvees driving with the speed of light and tanks firing as fast as an assault rifle would. This actually is such a universal way to make a game more fun. I don't know why more people do this. Apart from that, if you want to make something like this in Godot, use get property list. It really is your best friend, this function. Thank you for watching, and in the next video I will explain every single node in Godot.